Mr. Shapiro represents everything wrong with conservative America, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said from her podium under the CNN lights. And if you've watched enough town halls, you already know the rhythm she was aiming for. Designer blazer, statement jewelry, hair and makeup calibrated for high definition, voice tuned to that Instagram-friendly pitch that turns applause into clips. She talked about privilege and billionaires and lies, swinging big moral words like a hammer that never needs a nail. Half the Atlanta auditorium responded like it was a concert, squad merch everywhere, chants ready on standby, the kind of crowd that applauds before the sentence finishes. CNN framed the whole thing as political hypocrisy, and you could feel the producers praying for a clean hero vs. villain storyline. Jake Tapper sat between them, wearing the expression of a man who's hosted enough panels to recognize incoming turbulence. Ben Shapiro, meanwhile, looked like he'd shown up for a deposition, not a town hall, calm at his podium in a charcoal suit and blue tie. He had a thick folder with tabs, the kind you bring when you plan to take someone's talking points and staple them to the record. AOC kept going, louder now, feeding off the room. Working families, kids hungry, healthcare bankrupting the middle class, the full modern liturgy. She promised to expose hypocrisy, and the word expose always lands like a drumbeat because it implies there's something hidden, something you're about to be let in on. When she sat down, the progressive side stood and chanted her name like the debate had already ended on points. Tapper tried to reset the room, the way a referee steps between fighters before the bell, and he gestured to Shapiro to respond. Shapiro didn't rush, which is part of the performance too. Urgency reads as emotion, and emotion is the one thing he rarely gives away for free. Before we begin, he said, voice precise and steady, I want to thank Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez for suggesting this topic. Then he smiled slightly and added, excellent choice, because we're going to explore it in great detail. You could hear the auditorium tighten, that little hush that happens when people realize the script might be changing. Shapiro opened the folder like a man opening a ledger, and he started somewhere AOC probably didn't want to live for the next 10 minutes. Let's talk about the Met Gala, he said, and you didn't need a crystal ball to see the temperature shift. AOC's expression flickered, just a beat, like someone hearing the first note of a song they hoped the DJ wouldn't play. In my view, that flicker matters, because cameras catch what speeches try to hide. Surprise, calculation, the brain doing quick math. Shapiro framed it as symbolism versus reality, and symbolism is the arena AOC usually dominates. He described the event as elite, exclusive, expensive, and he leaned into the contrast between tax the rich rhetoric and a room full of rich people. AOC tried to slide into the safe lane. I was making a statement, but Shapiro, in this telling, didn't let her build a runway. He asked a blunt, yes or no question about payment, the kind of question politicians hate because it forces an answer instead of a narrative. The room held its breath, the way crowds do when they sense a clip is forming. Now, here's where I have to be careful, because the moment a story starts naming reports and findings, people assume it's all courtroom-certified truth. In this dramatized setup, Shapiro cites what he calls a House Ethics Committee document and reads it like it's gospel, seal and all. But notice the move. Even if a paper exists, the argument is still rhetorical. He's using the idea of an official finding to lock her into a defensive crouch. AOC responds with, eventually, which is the kind of word that sounds responsible until you hear it next to, how long did it take? And Shapiro's whole strategy here is time, making eventually feel like a confession of delay rather than a promise of compliance. He piles on details, attire, services, accessories, guest attendance, dollar values, and the audience reaction becomes part of the testimony. People gasp, phones come out, heads tilt like they're trying to decide whether to believe the paper or the vibe. AOC tries to explain context, because context is what you say when the raw shape of the story isn't flattering. Shapiro counters with the bluntest possible framing. Rules are rules, and working people pay their bills on time, so why didn't you? From a purely theatrical standpoint, it's effective, because it takes a complicated ethics and reimbursement discussion and turns it into an everyday moral question. He pushes the follow-up question theme, too, almost mocking the modern media habit of letting politicians skate after a single soft inquiry. Tapper becomes a prop in that moment, the symbol of moderation trying to keep the room polite, while the two speakers play for entirely different audiences. AOC supporters look stunned, not just because of the substance, but because the cadence shifted away from her strength. She's best when she can build a moral frame and make the opponent sound small inside it. Shapiro, in this narrative, refuses to fit inside her frame, and instead tries to shrink her inside his. After a break, the scene resets like Act 2 of a play. AOC touched up, staffers whispering, posture reassembled. Shapiro returns the way accountants return after lunch. Unmoved, reorganized, ready to keep counting. He adopts a friendlier tone, which can be more dangerous than anger, because it signals confidence and makes the other person look fragile by contrast. Maybe she can't afford it, he suggests, and that maybe is doing a lot of work. It pretends fairness while opening the trap. Then he pivots to lifestyle, where she lives, what she drives, where she shops, and you can almost hear the culture war gears grinding into place. He describes a luxury building with amenities that sound like a resort brochure. Pools, spas, simulators, lounges, fancy instruments. The whole DC is a theme park for adults with expense accounts vibe. AOC says housing is expensive, which is true, but Shapiro's point isn't about the city. It's about choice and branding. He contrasts campaign rhetoric about luxury developments with the optics of living in one, and optics are the currency of modern politics. Then he asks about her car, names the model, and brings up past criticism of corporate subsidies, drawing a neat line from speech to purchase. Whether you find that line fair or petty probably depends on which side you already walked in on, and that's exactly why it plays so well on camera. He brings in Whole Foods and Amazon because those names carry moral flavor in certain political circles. He claims she opposed Amazon HQ2 in Queens and implies she killed jobs, which is a phrase that lands like an accusation even when it's not legally precise. Here's the honest thing. Big development fights have real trade-offs, and people can sincerely disagree about incentives, housing pressures, labor leverage, and long-term community control. But Shapiro's style is not, let's explore complexity. It's, let's reduce this to a hypocrisy scorecard. And scorecards are addictive because they feel like math, even when they're really storytelling with numbers. In the next beat, he does what good debaters do. He turns the opponent's abstract compassion into a personal question. He brings up AOC's grandmother in Puerto Rico, invoking images of damage and hardship that many viewers remember from social media. Then he asks the question that lands like a punch, because it sounds like common sense. If you can help, why didn't you? AOC offers a family dynamic explanation, and Shapiro treats it like evasion, because anything longer than a sentence becomes not an answer in debate land. He adds a twist, saying conservative figures raised money, because it flips stereotypes and forces the audience to reconsider which side cares, at least within the story's logic. Let me say this clearly as a matter of responsible framing. The moment you tell a story like this, you're not giving a court transcript, you're giving a narrative. Narratives pick details, emphasize certain timelines, and turn messy realities into clean arcs. And clean arcs are almost always suspicious. Still, the reason these scenes spread is simple. The public is starving for accountability theater because actual accountability is slow, boring, and rarely televised. So the audience gets fed a substitute, a folder, a microphone, a gotcha question, and the illusion that we just watched a verdict. And people walk away feeling like they know what happened, even if what they really know is how it felt to watch it. By the time the script moves into student loans, the pattern is established. Take a broad issue, drag it into a personal ledger, and force the person to defend their own balance sheet. Shapiro frames debt forgiveness as ordinary taxpayers paying for someone else's choices, and he names archetypes, plumbers, single mothers, veterans, because archetypes are harder to argue with than statistics. AOC tries to widen the lens back to millions affected, and Shapiro snaps it shut again. We're talking about you right now, on this stage. That tug of war, system versus individual, might be the core argument of modern American politics. And it's why these debates turn into moral trials. If your worldview starts with structures, you see his focus as a dodge. If your worldview starts with responsibility, you see her generalities as a dodge. Then the story escalates again with a final identity twist. The Democratic Socialists of America, endorsements, movement purity, who belongs and who doesn't. Shapiro argues that even the left's left thinks she's not real, and he uses that to paint her as brand first, principle second. AOC pushes back with context, and again, context becomes the word that means, please don't make me live inside your framing. Shapiro praises ideological consistency in his opponents, which is a classic move. Compliment the extreme to isolate the celebrity politician as fake. It's clever because it lets him sound fair while still cutting her down, and it lets him borrow the authority of people he claims to disagree with. At this point in the narrative, AOC is crying, the crowd is deflated, and Tapper looks stunned. Classic climax staging. Then come the internet consequences, hashtags, clips, viral petitions, op-eds, party leaders panicking, challengers emerging, a resignation announcement, a Netflix irony epilogue. It's a tidy arc, almost too tidy, with the kind of moral symmetry real life rarely delivers on schedule. And that's where I plant my flag as personal opinion rather than prosecutor. When a story lands perfectly beat for beat, I start looking for because politics is messy, and if you're being sold a perfect takedown, you're usually being sold a product, not a reality. So what do I take from this, if I'm listening like a skeptical American and not like a fan in a jersey? First, the hypocrisy frame is a cheat code, and both sides use it, because hypocrisy is easier to prove than harm, and easier to sell than policy. Second, a folder full of receipts is not the same thing as a full accounting of the truth, especially when the audience can't verify every claim in real time. Third, the influencer-politician era makes everyone vulnerable. If your brand is virtue, your opponent will attack your lifestyle. If your brand is facts, your opponent will attack your motives. And fourth, the media stage rewards the cleanest narrative, not the most accurate one, which is why these moments feel definitive even when they're not. If you're pro-AOC, you'll say this whole thing is a smug conservative hit job dressed up as concern for working people. If you're anti-AOC, you'll say it's overdue accountability for a politician who talks left and lives like the professional class. If you're somewhere in the middle, you might notice something more boring and more important. Both characters are doing what their incentives demand. AOC is rewarded for moral clarity, emotional urgency, and calling out the system, And Shapiro is rewarded for precision strikes, contradictions, and turning symbolism into a punchline. And the audience, us, gets rewarded with the feeling of certainty, which might be the most expensive luxury of all. The questions that linger for me aren't even the ones this script is obsessed with. It's not just, did she pay, or where does she live? Because those become proxy wars for identity. The questions are, what do we want politics to be? Problem-solving or performance? And why do we keep paying most attention when it's performance? Why do we demand personal purity as proof of policy correctness, and then act shocked when politicians curate their lives like brands? And why do we treat viral humiliation as if it's the same thing as public service accountability, when humiliation mostly just creates the next round of fundraising emails? If this town hall happened exactly as narrated, it would be a brutal example of how quickly moral language collapses when someone forces a ledger into the conversation. If it didn't happen that way, it's still a revealing piece of political fiction, because it shows what each side imagines truth looks like on television. The left imagines truth as a moral awakening, naming villains, naming structures, calling people to conscience. The right imagines truth as a cross-examination, yes or no, dates, invoices, contradictions, the cold satisfaction of a cornered witness. And the country, stuck between those styles, keeps confusing winning the scene with fixing the problem, like we're all binge-watching government instead of living under it. I'm not going to tell you anyone here is a criminal, or that any document is beyond dispute, or that any one narrative should be swallowed whole. What I will tell you is that when politics becomes a stage, the audience becomes the product, and both sides are selling. Sometimes the sales pitch is hope. Sometimes it's disgust. Sometimes it's righteousness. Sometimes it's a smirk and a tabbed folder. Either way, the real question isn't who got embarrassed under the lights. The real question is whether we've built a system where embarrassment is the only consequence we can reliably deliver. But the room didn't stay silent for long, because silence on live television is like a vacuum, and somebody always rushes to fill it. Jake Tapper cleared his throat and tried to steer the conversation back toward policy, as if policy hadn't just been used as a backdrop for a character trial. AOC blinked hard, took a breath, and reached for the safest tool any politician has when the ground moves under their feet: a pivot. She started talking about wages again, about rent again, about health care again, because those topics feel like home turf, and home turf feels like oxygen. And Shapiro let her, at first, the way a boxer lets an opponent throw punches that look dramatic but don't land clean. I've always thought that's the real trick of these exchanges. One person wants a courtroom and the other wants a rally, and the moderator is stuck trying to pretend it's a seminar. AOC's eyes kept drifting to the audience monitors, the way people do when they're half speaking and half scanning for reaction. Shapiro's eyes stayed on her, steady, like he was timing her breath between sentences. When she said working families again, he didn't scoff. He just nodded slightly like, yes, yes, we've heard the slogan. Now, back to the invoice. It wasn't rage he projected. It was patience. And patience can read as cruelty when the other person is struggling to regain rhythm. AOC tried a different angle, a more personal one, because personal stories can soften a room faster than any statistic ever will. She talked about bartending, about her parents, about being a first-generation daughter, about what it feels like to look at Washington from the outside and then suddenly be inside it. And I'll admit, even in a story like this, that kind of testimony can land, because it's human, and humans still respond to humans more than they respond to spreadsheets. But Shapiro's response, in this narrative, was to treat biography like scenery. Interesting, but not relevant to whether the bill got paid. He asked again, not loudly, not theatrically, just again, and the repetition itself became the pressure. At some point, you could feel the crowd splitting into smaller crowds inside the same room. There were the loyalists who wanted AOC to swing back with a clean moral comeback, something sharp enough to stitch the wound shut. There were the skeptics who came to watch a spectacle, and now realized the spectacle had teeth. There were the people who didn't even like Shapiro, but still enjoyed the sensation of watching someone powerful get forced into specifics. And there were the cynics who weren't cheering for either one, just watching the whole thing like a national hobby. Pick a side, pretend it's a sport, call it civic engagement. Tapper tried to ask about housing policy, like a man tossing a life preserver into a storm, and AOC grabbed it instantly. She moved into her comfort zone, arguing that economic pressures in Washington aren't the same as luxury, that the broader point is a rigged system, that focusing on one person's apartment is a distraction. That line always sounds reasonable because it is reasonable in the abstract, and the abstract is where most political arguments are safest. Shapiro waited for the end of the sentence, then did that thing he does where he takes your abstract point and shrinks it down to a single concrete question. If it's a distraction, he asked, why is it the distraction you keep feeding with branding, merch, aesthetics, and curated moral outrage? Now, I'm not saying that's a fair question. I'm saying it's a sharp one, and sharp questions are what these stages are built to reward. AOC tried to call it attacking her personally, which is the classic defense when someone is trying to make your lifestyle stand in for your values. Shapiro insisted it wasn't personal. It was consistency, and consistency is the word people use when they want to sound principled while still throwing elbows. Tapper asked them both to keep it respectful, and that phrase always cracks me up a little, because modern politics treats respect like a costume you wear while you're swinging. AOC nodded, Shapiro nodded, and you could tell neither one planned to change a single thing about their approach. The strange part was how quickly the debate stopped being about conservatism versus progressivism and became something more intimate and more American. It became about whether public figures owe the public a certain kind of personal purity, or whether that expectation is just a new form of entertainment disguised as ethics. Because, if you think about it, we didn't even elect philosophers, we elected humans. And humans are inconsistent by nature. But then again, these aren't random humans. These are humans who sell moral certainty as their product. And products come with claims on the label. So the question becomes, if you market yourself as the anti-elite, can you ever live like the elite without paying an authenticity tax? During another attempted pivot, AOC tried to flip the lens and put Shapiro on trial for his own career and income. She pointed at his media empire, his speaking fees, the money conservative commentary can generate, the donors, the machinery behind it. You could feel the audience perk up, because that's the moment they were waiting for. The moment where she stops absorbing punches and throws one back. And Shapiro, in this telling, didn't deny he makes money. He simply treated it like a confession that isn't a confession because it's already public. He said, essentially, yes, I'm a capitalist, I don't pretend otherwise. And that's what makes your posture look like theater. That's when you saw the deeper logic of his attack. It wasn't, you're wealthy, it was, you're pretending you're not. And whether that's true or not in real life is one thing, but as a narrative move, it's powerful, because it turns every defense into more material. If she says she's allowed to live well, he says great, then stop scolding others from the mountaintop. If she says she represents working people, he says fine, then live like you actually believe what you preach. If she says it's complicated, he says the complication is the excuse you use when the simple answer looks bad. Tapper tried to end the segment, because moderators eventually realize when the temperature is climbing faster than their control. But the crowd wasn't ready to leave, because crowds rarely want closure. They want dominance. They want a clear winner. They want the satisfying click of a narrative lock. AOC asked for 30 seconds, Shapiro asked for 30 seconds, and suddenly everyone needed 30 seconds like it was oxygen. The camera cut to the audience, and you could see the microdrama. A woman with squad merch biting her lip. A man in a blazer nodding slowly. A college kid filming with a grin that looked a little too delighted. That grin is what haunts politics now. The grin of people who aren't listening for truth. They're listening for a moment. By the time the broadcast wrapped, the stage looked less like a town hall and more like the end of a long night where nobody feels clean. AOC stood up with that tight posture people get when they're trying not to look rattled, and she thanked the audience with a voice that sounded steadier than her hands. Shapiro closed his folder with a kind of neat finality that, if I'm being honest, reads like a mic drop without the theatrics. Tapper said something about important conversations, and I always laugh at that phrase because it's what you say when the conversation turned into a brawl. Then the lights dimmed, and the real debate began where it always begins now. On phones, in edits, inside captions, inside the little choices that turn raw footage into a weapon. If you've ever watched a political team in crisis, it's less like West Wing and more like a restaurant during a surprise rush. People moving fast, whispering, checking screens, calling someone who knows someone, trying to stop a leak after the pipe already burst. AOC's staffers would, in a story like this, be drafting statements with the same ingredients everyone uses: misleading, out of context, bad faith, smear, distraction. Shapiro's side would be clipping the cleanest exchanges, the sharpest pauses, the moments where she hesitated. Because hesitation is the closest thing to blood you can show on television without showing blood. And CN, bless their hearts, would be trying to decide whether to frame it as heated exchange or substantive scrutiny, as if those two things don't live in the same body now. Here's the part I can't stop thinking about, and it has nothing to do with whether you like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Ben Shapiro. It's the way modern politics punishes complexity and rewards certainty, even when certainty is just confidence with a microphone. If AOC had said plainly, "Yes, I made mistakes. Here's what I learned. Here's what I changed," would anyone have shared it? Or would people have yawned and moved on because accountability without humiliation doesn't scratch the itch the internet has? And if Shapiro had said, "Look, nuance matters. Development deals are complicated. Ethics rules can be technical," would anyone have cared? Or would they have called him soft? That's why these stories metastasize, because they're not really about policy. They're about social meaning. They're about tribe, identity, the pleasure of seeing the other side sweat, the comfort of seeing your side look righteous. In my opinion, the scariest thing isn't that a politician might be inconsistent. It's that we've built a culture where inconsistency is treated like the highest crime, and spectacle is treated like justice. We train ourselves to hunt for hypocrisy, because hypocrisy is easy to spot and hard to defend in 30 seconds. Meanwhile, the slow, boring failures that actually cost people money, time, health, and opportunity keep rolling along in the background like a conveyor belt nobody films. And you could see that conveyor belt in the way the audience reacted, even inside this dramatized version. Some people didn't care about the numbers at all. They cared about the vibe, and the vibe of a takedown is intoxicating. Some people didn't care about the vibe at all. They cared about the numbers, and they'd already decided numbers don't lie, even when the framing does. Some people watched it like a morality play and walked away with the same moral they arrived with. just louder. And a small group, the rarest group, watched it and felt something uncomfortable. Uncertainty. The feeling that maybe their favorite narrative is missing pieces. And that uncertainty is where I want to end this. Because uncertainty is the one thing modern political storytelling treats like a failure instead of a signal. We're trained to believe that if a moment doesn't land with a clean verdict, it didn't matter, when in reality the moments that matter most are the ones that refuse to close neatly. This exchange, real or imagined in its precise details, works as a mirror more than a gavel, and mirrors don't sentence anyone. They just show you what's already there. What it shows, at least to me, isn't a hero or a villain, but two different models of power colliding under studio lights. One model runs on moral urgency and symbolism, the other on contradiction and precision, and both are optimized for attention rather than resolution. If you strip away the names and the applause cues, what's left is a question older than cable news and newer than social media. Do we judge leaders by the world they describe or by the lives they live? And what happens when those two things don't line up perfectly? Because almost no one's life lines up perfectly with their ideals, and pretending otherwise is the oldest lie politics tells itself. At the same time, almost everyone knows the difference between occasional compromise and permanent branding, between human inconsistency and curated contradiction. The trouble is that line is subjective, and subjectivity is poison in a culture addicted to screenshots. There's a reason these confrontations feel satisfying in the moment and hollow a week later. They give us the emotional payoff of accountability without the slow work of governance. They let us believe that exposure equals improvement, that embarrassment equals reform, that a clever exchange can substitute for structural change. It's political fast food, salty, addictive, immediately gratifying, and strangely empty once you step away. You feel like you've eaten something important, but you're hungry again almost immediately. I keep thinking about how easily hypocrisy becomes a shortcut around harder conversations. It's easier to argue about someone's apartment than about zoning policy. It's easier to argue about a car than about transportation infrastructure. It's easier to argue about a gala than about campaign finance. And yet we convince ourselves we're talking about substance because the argument feels personal, because it feels raw. What makes this dynamic especially corrosive is that it teaches every ambitious politician the same lesson. Don't admit error unless you're forced, because admission will be clipped and replayed as weakness. Don't live modestly unless you plan to perform modesty forever, because any deviation will be framed as betrayal. Don't engage nuance on hostile ground, because nuance dies in 30-second segments. And above all, never let your opponents define the terms of your identity, because once they do, you're arguing on their stage. That lesson doesn't produce better leaders, it produces better performers. It encourages people who can hold a brand under pressure, not people who can revise their thinking in public. It rewards the politician who can withstand humiliation rather than the one who can incorporate criticism. And it slowly trains voters to expect theater instead of competence, to confuse moral outrage with moral clarity. Over time, that confusion hardens into cynicism, and cynicism is the most efficient voter suppression tool ever invented. You can already see the downstream effects everywhere. Politicians speak in slogans because slogans survive clipping. Debates turn into trials because trials feel decisive. Policy becomes set dressing because nobody's sharing the spreadsheet. And the audience, exhausted and overstimulated, starts treating politics the way they treat reality television. Pick a favorite, boo the villain, move on. I don't say this to defend Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or to indict Ben Shapiro. I say it because focusing only on who won misses the more uncomfortable truth about why moments like this resonate. They resonate because they flatter us, because they let us feel smarter than the person being cornered. They resonate because they confirm our priors, whichever direction those priors point. They resonate because they promise moral order in a system that feels increasingly chaotic. But moral order built on humiliation is fragile. It doesn't teach, it warns. It doesn't persuade, it punishes. And it doesn't build trust, it burns it, slowly at first, then all at once. The irony is that everyone involved usually believes they're serving the people, even as the people become an abstract audience rather than a lived responsibility. If there's a takeaway here that isn't just another hot take, it might be this. Accountability without empathy turns into spectacle, and empathy without accountability turns into branding. Both are distortions, and both thrive in the same media ecosystem that claims to despise them. The harder work lives somewhere in between, in the unshareable space where answers are incomplete and trade-offs are explicit. That space doesn't trend, but it's the only place where policy actually lives. I don't know whether exchanges like this change minds in any durable way. I suspect they mostly harden existing positions while entertaining the undecided. They give commentators material, activists fuel, and algorithms exactly what they crave. Conflict with clear faces attached. What they rarely give us is a deeper understanding of why the problems being argued over are so stubborn in the first place. And without that understanding, every new takedown just resets the cycle at a higher volume. So when the lights go off and the clips stop looping, what remains isn't a fallen icon or a crowned victor. What remains is a political culture still struggling to decide whether it wants truth or triumph, whether it wants leaders who perform righteousness or leaders who practice responsibility, whether it wants debates that feel good or debates that lead somewhere uncomfortable but useful. Those questions don't fit cleanly into a broadcast segment, but they're the only ones worth sitting with after the noise fades. If this story lingers, it shouldn't be because someone looked weak or someone looked clever. It should linger because it exposes how easily we mistake exposure for progress, how quickly we substitute personal judgment for collective solutions, how tempting it is to believe that calling out contradiction is the same thing as solving contradiction, and how often we forget that politics isn't a morality play. It's a shared project with consequences that extend far beyond the stage. In the end, the most revealing thing isn't what either figure said under pressure. It's how eagerly we watched, how quickly we chose. That satisfaction is comfortable, but it's also dangerous, because it teaches us to expect politics to end with applause instead of work. And work, unlike applause, doesn't care how clean your narrative is. It only cares whether the decisions made in its name actually hold up when the cameras are gone.